There are people around the world who did not buy into the COVID narrative, and a lot of the same people have not bought into the Ukraine narrative. I'm going to refer to them as panhumans. Panhumanism is an existing term, but it's close enough to my intended meaning that I feel comfortable using it. A panhuman, in my book, is someone who's capable of independent thought. They're somebody who is capable of making the effort to look at the publicly available and officially published facts on a matter and coming to their own conclusion, even if, or especially if, it contradicts the narrative that's been put out by MSM, the mainstream media. In COVID, as people who have followed my Peerless Rees channel will understand, the narrative never was justified and backed up by the data. It was clear from China by March 15th, when their contagion was over, that this was not an existential threat, that horrible phrase, for the West. The data in the European and American markets, or whatever you want to call them, American and European countries, backed that up. It showed that growth of the contagion was already slowing, and that's by March 15th. By March 23rd, when lockdown was established, there was no excuse to treat this as a significant threat. Lockdowns, we demonstrated mathematically, had zero effect in 52 of the 70-odd lockdowns internationally recognized. There is no ambiguity as to what the narrative was about. It was massive threat, lockdown, and then on April the 5th, Bill Gates gave us the punchline. No normal until the vaccine. Or as he put it, something along the lines of, I think it's fair to say that things won't truly go back to normal until we basically get the vaccine out to the whole world. Well, sure, if that's what you want to do, then the narrative will support it. We demonstrated in our first video that the risk from the data coming out of China, which was backed up by all the Western nations following that, showed that this was not a material threat to ordinary people without comorbidities. We saw figures between 90 to 95%, where people who died of COVID had on average 2 existing serious illnesses. So here was a disease, a virus, a phenomenon that required you to have 2 existing serious issues, potentially life-threatening, before you could be killed. We saw consistently through the 2020 narrative, 2020 data, that the actual threat from COVID was a tiny fraction of the threat of simply being alive. Even in the worst case, even disregarding the distinction about comorbidities, the threat to life from COVID was 14% for an OAP, somebody around the age of 75, 80. Your risk of dying at 80 is 14%. So COVID was no more dangerous than continuing to breathe and disregarding it. Once you factor in comorbidities, for a teenager, ordinary life was hundreds of times more dangerous than COVID. But none of this made it to the mainstream media. The narrative was all. And since then we've gone on to Ukraine, which when my wife announced that Putin had invaded, I was shocked and didn't know what to think. So what did I do? I went and had a look at the history of Ukraine. It didn't take long to find out that the West, Victoria Nuland, had engineered a coup to replace the pro-Russian government with a pro-Western government. And then, of course, we had the assistance of far-right NAZI organisations, proudly NAZI organisations, who boasted of burning people alive in a protest. A proud day for the nation, as Right Nation put it. These are not people that we were supposed to be defending or promoting or arming and supporting. And yet that's exactly what we did, because it was convenient to people like Victoria Nuland to create anything that would antagonize Russia. Now, Victoria Nuland, of course, when I saw this, it was like, my God, is the wife to Robert Kagan. Robert Kagan is one of the neocons. He founded the Project for New American Century. The people who came up with a strategy to take down the enemies of a certain Middle Eastern country, but were blocked, absent a new Pearl Harbor. How convenient that 9/11 occurred. So we have people whose allegiance is not to the West, but is to a certain Middle Eastern country and a certain Eastern European country. Those are the homelands it pays homage to. And they have engineered war in the two regions of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. And the West is entirely enamored of this agenda, to the point that it utterly refuses to acknowledge anything which contradicts their brutal and blatant anti-Russia narrative. At this point, my perception is that I cannot have allegiance to the concept of a nation that engages in such behavior. And so I'm going to use the term a panhuman to reflect somebody who is capable of analytical thought, who is capable of independent thought, and who operates on a system of ethics and morals that are consistent and appropriate worldwide. I have no desire to see any such infrastructure as a so-called panhumanist government or organization, because we have seen that humans will turn any organization into an authoritarian, hierarchical infrastructure with 80 to 90% of the masses being entirely subservient to the narrative, and therefore completely destroying the very principles that I believe a reasonable and ethical person should stand for. So, not sure where we'll go from here, but maybe it's time we started to recognize that we need to be loyal to something other than our team, our nation. Maybe we need to be loyal to ethics and morals and the human race.